As an architectural visualizer, I just want to talk to you all about how we've really found that V-Ray has been the catalyst that's really allowed us to grow from a fairly small two-man team into now quite a recognised practice capable of producing photorealistic CGIs. So what I'm thinking is, as V-Ray users yourselves, you may benefit from a bit of background on us, where I'd quite like to run over some projects that I feel were critical in our development as an organisation, and also some of the lessons that we learned from these. So my name's Dan Stone, and I'm Head of Operations for Archilime Visualizations and also the newly formed Archilime Academy. And our relationship with SketchUp and V-Ray began around 10 years ago whilst at university studying architecture. So I'm sure we've all been there to some extent as students. You don't have too much spare cash lying around, and SketchUp really was one of the most affordable pieces of software out there. And those of you new to SketchUp you must have tried installing plugins and different types of renderers as well. And we must have tried every single renderer under the sun. And most of them we found were these one-click renderers. You know, you've got your SketchUp model, one click, and you've got a render. But we tend to find that those just left us wanting more. You know, we wanted to build careers for ourselves out of this. So, you familiar with V-Ray? Around about 10 years ago, this is what it looked like. This is V-Ray 1.4, and as you can see, it definitely doesn't look like one of these one-click renderers. There's so much to learn. And as I'm sure you've all experienced as well, YouTube really was our savior in teaching ourselves basically to a level so that we were comfortable to then take our knowledge of V-Ray and SketchUp out of university and then into professional practice. So now I'd just like to talk to you about one of our early projects that we did whilst leaving university. And initially, similar to the approach that Ivan took with his lighting, we do like to render our scenes in clay format or with material override turned on first, as this allows us to then interactively test how our lighting looks. You know, so we'd expose the primary light source, which in this case is the sun or the environment, and then we'd fill those darker areas with artificial lighting like we've done inside there. We'd also add a little bit of colour as well, because it just tends to add that little bit of extra life to the project. So we knew from the get-go that the quality in the vegetation really will make for a good exterior CGI. And so what we did here is we actually went and purchased some of these vegetation models from a website called Xfrog, which I'd definitely recommend you go and try out. And what we did was meticulously place each one of these trees in the background there in accordance with a tree survey, which was handed over to us when we began the project. And that was about as tedious as it sounds. There were dozens and dozens of trees there, and wasn't the most stimulating part of the project. For a few years, and with one of our most complex projects to date, really. This project was to win planning permission under paragraph 55, which is now known as paragraph, which is a piece of planning law where a few of these get passed in the UK every year, as the dwelling has to be of exceptional quality or innovative in its nature of design. And so a huge part of this is, you know, just how sensitive is this proposal to the defining characteristics of the local area? How well does it sit within the landscape? So in a nutshell, we knew that we had to step up the quality of our vegetation. So we went out of our way and imported lots of good quality bits of 3D vegetation. What we then decided to do was look into a new plugin at the time called Scatter. I know Ivan used a different technique at the start of the talk yesterday, but we found Scatter to be really successful in being able to randomly distribute vegetation. Really, it's a really nice way of merging high quality vegetation with your 3D scenes. So our next big challenge was scalability. We were very comfortable producing CGIs on a small scale with plots or very few plots. Here was our biggest development at the time, 80 plus units with 12 house types, I think, off the top of my head. This generally meant we had two issues to solve. The 3D models we would be using would naturally just be so much larger, and we'd also need to see an increase in the number of CGIs we were to produce. So we sat down and took stock and decided to find a logistical solution to both of them. The first, trying to solve the modeling issue, there's a plugin out there called Profile Builder, which allowed us to create these parametric assemblies in very few clicks, as you can see here in the bottom left. I had a lovely GIF to show you all yesterday, but I think that's what was causing my audio to drop off. We then decided to look into how to increase our rendering capacity. And as Ivan has literally just covered, we decided to look into increasing the amount of cores we had within the office. By that, I mean we purchased more machines, and you can borrow computing power from those machines either locally in the same office or building as your main machine, or also, as Ivan said, using the V-Ray Cloud, which is Chaos Group's service, where you can almost send your file over and ask Chaos Group to render it for you. So now we're taking a look at some historic projects. I think it would be a good time now to run over some tips. The first of which, I'd just like to take a look at sourcing some high quality vegetation, and just giving you a few different sources for you to go ahead and download some models from. So the green blobs you can see here, these are all from a plugin called Laubwerk, Laubwerk. Feel free to ask questions, and we can go over this in the Q&A later. This is a plugin within SketchUp, which houses a library full of vegetation. You can download extra packs relevant to your area, and we've found this to be really, really useful for us, because in a few clicks, what we have here is realistic vegetation, which is brought in already render ready. We also have the option of using XFrog and VisPark OBJ 3D models, which do require you to make sure that they are render ready in SketchUp before you start using them. Another tip I'd like you to consider, it kind of goes without saying, but consider how the entities within your model space would actually exist in the real world. So obviously, if you want realism, you have to be prepared to model the details. If you've got a window in a recess, make sure it's set back by the correct amount. Don't leave anything as indicative. Same with textures. If you're trying to recreate a texture from a precedent image, then have them both open side by side. You could be working on your V-Ray material whilst you're then constantly referring to your precedent image, which is just on the other screen. The same goes with lighting. Have an idea of what type of lighting setup you want to create before you even start with the interactive rendering. What you'll find is that you'll have much more structure if you already know and you can preempt the type of lighting setup you want to start creating. What I'd recommend doing is definitely starting with your primary source of exposure. So we're talking about the primary light source here, which is going to be doing the majority of the lighting within your scene. This differs across all 6 images here, but you will notice that some images are darker than others. What we can do is use secondary or fill lights, like we did with that first project that I showed you. We can fill those darker areas and use accent lights to highlight certain architectural details as you see fit. So in terms of what else we offer today, we do have a service called 3D Design Development, where we sit down with architects or designers and their clients, and we develop a 3D model of their design together. So as you can see with the images here, this final image started off as a very, very simple blocky SketchUp model, which then underwent several revisions before finally turning into a hopefully photorealistic image, which you can see on your screens there. What we tend to find is including the clients in these processes tends to minimize the discrepancies between the clients and the architects, whilst also increases the client buy-in, and it just engages them more across that journey. We've also decided to start offering a marketing package, which is an app that aims to compile all of our different visualization services into one hyperlink. So this allows us to really interrogate the project. As you can see in the top left here, what we've got is an aerial CGI that we can then cycle through each of the different units and then see the different bits of media which are relevant to those specific units. We tend to find that with large developments that require a few more CGIs to self and plan, these go down really well. And the final thing I'd like to talk about is the Archilime Academy. And I know we've got a few listeners today from the Archilime Academy as well, so I'd like to say hello to you all. The origins of the Academy was, it was created because clients and colleagues of ours had just been asking us for years how to create CGIs. So courses at the moment, as you just saw, were taught online via Zoom, and we aim to take a holistic approach towards building your 3D understanding. We aim to provide resources such as course manuals, as you can see here, aftercare periods, one-to-one sessions, and just generally a gateway into the architectural visualization community. Basically, we want to offer you the things that we wish we would have had 10 years ago when we were starting out. But starting out impossible without the functionality of V-Ray. It really gave us that springboard photo, really, we could end up doing the job that we love. So this is pretty much our abbreviated story with regards to exterior CGIs. I hope this highlights some of the roadblocks we've faced, how we've overcome them, and hopefully puts you in a better position to do the same.
Thank you, Dan. That was incredible. Wow. I'm really glad actually that now we're gonna go straight back to Dan, and we're gonna have a look at a more specific workflow for interiors, and then we've still got loads of questions, so we'll go through an open floor with both Ivan and Dan as well. But back to you, Dan, for interiors.
Thanks, Lauren. So let's dive back in. Focus on exterior CGIs when we left university, but we quickly realised in a professional practice, we needed to develop our interior skill set as well. So like we did with the exterior CGIs, I'd quite like to run over some interior projects we've done in the past to highlight some of those workflow tweaks that some of you may benefit from. There was no real question over what piece of software we were going to use for our interiors. We'd already developed quite a good workflow with exterior CGIs that we just felt there was no point reverting back to these one-click renderers, as it doesn't give you the same options that V-Ray does with regards to lighting, for example. Now, I've been looked into this as well, and I hope what you're taking from this webinar is that the lighting within V-Ray is just so dynamic and then easy to manipulate. It really allows you to focus in on exactly what you'd like to achieve. So looking at our first project, our first interior project, sorry, it was a unique restaurant in London in a really, really narrow arcade. And our first issue that we had with this project was not actually to do with V-Ray, it was to do with the space itself. I'm sure you've all experienced this. You're trying to navigate around your model and you just get stuck in a wall, or you just get lost within your model. A big part of this project was finding workarounds, really, just to ensure that we could capture exactly what the client wanted us to. So what we did is we actually looked into different techniques we can use to tweak the field of view of the V-Ray camera. So by going up to camera and then field of view in SketchUp, what you can do is then type in a different focal length, either in degrees or in millimeters, which allows you to almost swap out a lens on the SketchUp and the V-Ray camera. Moving on, we did notice with this project that we've added quite a lot of population here. As you can see, there's lots and lots of pieces of furniture and trinkets here and there. And with the machines we had at the time, which were less than desirable, what we had to do was really look into proxies. And as Ivan said, these are really, really good ways of being able to minimize the amount of geometry or polygons within your SketchUp model spaces, whilst also allowing you to be able to see that object once rendered. We also noticed with this project that, especially with older versions of V-Ray, when you had a bright light source, a primary or a secondary light source, and you're looking directly at it, older versions of V-Ray weren't as good at rendering that out. So what we had to do was make sure that light sources were powerful enough and effective enough in distributing rays of light realistically, as we had to balance our light efficiently. Or as a recommendation, if you're finding it too difficult to try and resolve your view, I would just change that entirely and then just start again. Fast forward a few years and we're approached by quite a prestigious interior designer from the Midlands, and her ethos was all about really high quality finishes and minimalistic designs. You know, it's not to the same degree, we haven't populated this CGI to the same degree that we'd done previously. So what this did was this actually allowed us more time in our modeling budget, if you want to call it that, for experimentation with some more advanced techniques within V-Ray. So as you can see, first up on the right here, down by the right of the candle, we can see some slight imperfections on the surface. We've got some condensation in the windows as well. And we find touches like this just add a layer of realism to our work. We're using alpha marks there as highlight gloss maps, just to try and mirror life's imperfections, which only increases the realism in your work. Our interior specialist, Casey, is an absolute master at this. Things like adding smudges on a surface or adding grunge to concrete, they all use this technique of just layering alpha masks over the top of textures that you've already got. We also decided to add some atmospheric fog in V-Ray. So what we did is we decided to control the height, density, and then color of that fog, and then you choose which light sources affect it. So rays of light from that light source will scatter and bounce through the fog before then entering the camera. It adds a really nice, realistic touch to your work. And something which Ivan touched is round cornering, and the idea that you would never see a hard edge in the real world is something which we stand by as well. So what we tend to use is a plugin called Round Corner to smooth and round those edges. You may see on the left here we've got some dashed lines. It almost looks hatched. This is just the number of soft edges that we have, which are part of those rounded edges, which were hard edges beforehand. So we moved into just interior project, I guess you could say. It was a large development of high-end interiors in the middle of Exeter. So this was, for the most part, this was all interior CGIs. I think we only did about 3 exteriors out of about 20 images in total. And the clients let us know very early on that there would be a lot of movement on the design. So eventually it transpired that we ended up having around 3 wholesale changes to each space. What this meant was that we knew ahead of time that we'd have to be able to future-proof our work. This was made possible by an organized components library. And I would highly advise everyone out there using SketchUp and V-Ray to do the same thing. Due to the high-end nature of the project, we went out and purchased some really, really good quality texture maps from sources such as Polygon, or in this case, Extreme Textures. And a technique we've worked out whilst working on this project was that we really needed to be testing at least one draft at really high resolution before we sent anything out to the clients. This allowed us to work on the texturing in a way which you can't quite pick up on a really, really low quality render. So let's take a look at some tips. So some tips from us to you. I would definitely recommend for both exterior and interior images using precedent photographs or images or other CGIs you've seen to set the mood of the lighting ahead of time. Like we said before, consider that primary light source, as that's where the main source of your illumination in your model will come from. Then fill those dark areas with secondary lights and use accent lights sparingly to draw the eye to particular areas of focus. That would be a good example, just a tiny side lamp there. We tend to find that if you lean on this structure, you should be able to create any lighting setup feasible. There hasn't been something which I haven't been able to, there hasn't been a lighting setup I haven't been able to accomplish by using this technique. Just to add something onto this, grainy images or noisy images are mostly caused by not enough photons hitting a surface. So what we can say is lighting is the root cause of most issues that we see with noise. Another tip I'd like to give you is to really get familiar with the section plane. So this most likely isn't new to any of you, but they really do allow us to almost carve away certain areas of our model and render views of your interior spaces, which you just quite simply couldn't see before or couldn't access. If the room's too tight or cramped, using these section planes would enable you to open up that space. So we must always look to try and recreate reality. So the alternative to using a section plane, if you're in a really tight space, is just to maybe shift the wall back by 1 meter. But we don't want to be misleading, so I'd highly recommend that you use section planes where you can and just cleverly position the camera so that you don't see any of the cuts like you can see here. One last tip I'd like to give you, this time on materials. So a common mistake that people make is not really looking into how your material reacts to light or how reflective it is. So we can see here on the, we've got 4 different iterations of predominantly the same texture. And now everything should have reflection in varying degrees. So try pulling the color or intensity up in your reflection as high as it will go to then get something that's glossy, at least in the second texture here. What we can then do is take a look at resolving the glossiness of those reflections. You can see they're a lot blurrier here and less defined than material number 2, but it is still quite uniform. Moving on to the 4th texture, we can see that we can actually make out the grain so much more than we can do in texture number 3. Now this is because we've used a black and white reflection or specular map within the reflection glossiness. I'd like to talk about other interior centric services that we now offer. First up, this is virtual tours. And now, as Ivan mentioned yesterday briefly, it is possible to create 360-degree panoramics using a different camera type within V-Ray. So you could create a spherical image, which is kind of like a world map, or you could create a cube map, which is like an unfurled net of a cube. Both of these can be considered alternative V-Ray camera lenses. And from a professional standpoint, we have found in the current climate that these are more popular than they've ever been. Our developer clients especially use these to really increase client engagement, as it's fairly straightforward to link multiple panoramics of a particular project together into a virtual tour. We also do a little bit of product rendering as well. As V-Ray isn't limited to architectural visualizations, you could take your 3D models or textures into a light studio and render these to create product CGIs. So we also offer this as a service. We tend to find that furniture makers and flooring providers, they get in touch with us with their bespoke designs, which we'll then create in SketchUp and V-Ray, and then get these rendered out in a light studio. And lastly, just to touch back on the Academy, as this was developed with just as much interiors in mind as with exteriors. And as you can see, we're running courses online at the moment through Zoom. And what we like to do is, as we saw before, we include course manuals, screen recordings, one-to-one sessions, and an insight into everything that comes with producing CGIs. Things like hardware requirements, you know, how we price our work, technical developments, new features, and networking opportunities. So just to round everything up, there is a very good reason why V-Ray is the industry standard for interior CGIs. The level of quality and outputs in texturing and lighting is unmatched as far as we're concerned. And now that's us. I hope it helps hearing from people that have been in similar positions to yourselves. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to submit them here, or as I'm active on LinkedIn, get in touch for a chat on there as well. So I'll now hand you back over to Lauren for a few questions and answers. And thanks very much for getting involved today.
Thank you, Dan. That was, and keep safe and well. Bye, guys.